Hello, everyone, and welcome. Jean-Michel, we are officially recording and live streaming, so the screen is yours.
Ladies, gentlemen, very welcome at Florence School. You are welcome. Good news, isn't it? You are welcome by the two directors. We are FSR Energy and Climate. Climate, Simone Borghesi. Energy, me. And if you look at the screen, we are very similar. A few differences, non-essential, that's spectacles and other details. We are very happy to welcome today Christopher Kardish for his excellent report, Carbon Leakage and Deep Decarbonization, a very key question for our future. This report is fresh from June 2020, and I will let Simone introducing Christopher. Simone, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jean-Michel. It's a real pleasure to have Christopher today with us. I will say a few words to introduce him. Christopher is carbon market analyst at ICAP, the International Carbon Action Partnership, an organization of 39 governments active in carbon policies and carbon markets. And he is also a project manager at Adelphi. At ICAP, he works, is specialized in emissions trading, in market mechanism and climate finance in particular, and manages the ICAP external communications. As far as the ETS are concerned, he works on the North American ones in particular, but also on the technical design of emissions trading systems in general. So, which means working on carbon leakage, as we will hear in a second, on allowance allocation, competitiveness, carbon neutrality, all topics that Christopher is going to talk about today. He was in the past consultant at the SEEK Development Global Development Consultancy. He has a BA from Ohio University, a master from Hertie School of Governance, and a PhD from the Mercator Research Institute. So just to remind our audience how is the event structure, Christopher will present the report in about 20 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions from us, from the FSR team, and from you. If you want to intervene, just write your questions in the Q&A, and we will try to pick them up during the event. So having said that, Christopher, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Simone, and thank you, Jean-Michel, for the lovely introduction. I'll go ahead and share my screen and hop right into it. I think you already did a pretty good job of introducing ICAP. Okay, and we can all see the slides? Okay. So yeah, I'm going to talk today about our report released in June on carbon leakage and deep decarbonization. And again, I'm Chris Kardish at the ICAP Secretariat. Quickly to talk a little bit more about ICAP before I start, we're an intergovernmental forum of national and subnational jurisdictions that either have emissions trading systems or are actively working to build them. And we act as sort of a knowledge exchange and an exchange of experiences and best practices, as well as active in capacity building in places where they're still trying to build carbon markets. And I'm particularly active in our technical dialogue work stream, which brings together our jurisdictions to talk about key issues of design in terms of like events, research, and other inputs into policy dialogue. So this report, which was released in June, again, is titled Carbon Leakage and Deep Decarbonization, Future-Proofing Carbon Leakage Protection. We focus here on the role of emissions trading systems in decarbonizing specifically emissions-intensive trade-exposed industries. EITE is the acronym. So you also sometimes hear them referred to as basic materials, basic industrial materials. That typically includes things like cement, steel, aluminum, chemicals, pulp and paper, fertilizers. And These are the industries that are commonly considered vulnerable to carbon leakage. The way that emissions trading systems deal with this issue of carbon leakage, whereby emissions are displaced to another place, or domestic industries lose market share, is through free allocation, the application of free allocation to offset carbon costs by giving allowances for free, often with a benchmark on emissions intensity. We took as a starting point in this report that there will be future constraints in this approach, this widespread approach to the leakage problem, in terms of and these constraints will affect sort of the longevity and the effectiveness of this approach in the long term. So first, you have declining allowance budgets. Many places are looking at higher ambition to 2030, and of course, mid-century net zero targets, which imply a constraint on the supply of free allowances, especially in places like the EU, where there's a fairly narrow sectoral scope. Then, of course, this approach to allocation, what comes into question is the potential for distortions in investment, innovation, and incentives for downstream abatement, all of which are very much needed as we approach net zero. There's a demand for incentives and credible investment frameworks to build markets for low carbon goods and to attain more low carbon consumption. And then lastly, we're facing a changing carbon pricing landscape. These provisions for free allocation often assume, well, they don't take into consideration carbon pricing that is happening among trading partners. And we're likely to see carbon pricing continue to grow in the years ahead. And the question will then become increasingly, does this industry face competitors who do not have a similar carbon price in place? We care about this sector, these sectors in particular, because these basic materials account for already something around a quarter of global emissions. And that's likely, that could very well continue as a proportion of global emissions, because global demand is expected to more than double over the course of this century as the world economy grows, but particularly in developing and emerging economies. There will be strong demand for steel, cement, and other basic materials. The challenge ahead of us is that these sectors are also perhaps uniquely challenging to reduce emissions. So for instance, a considerable portion of the emissions from these industries comes from the production process itself. So for the conversion of iron ore and other materials into iron, then conversion of iron into steel, or limestone into lime in the production of cement clinker. And this implies a need for new equipment, new production processes, none of which is easy. Then these processes also often require high temperature heat. And there are, which of course implies heavy energy inputs, and there are limited opportunities to electrify many of these inputs based on current technologies and carbon prices. And then lastly, of course, many of these materials produce considerable emissions at the end of life, particularly plastics. And this is also not to be neglected, so implying a high need for recycling and recirculation. Fortunately, there are opportunities to reduce emissions across both the supply and demand for industrial materials, all of which carbon pricing plays a role, but faces constraints because of this leakage problem. And so we sort of chart these across the supply and demand side. Looking at the supply side, you have more incremental gains from fuel switching and production efficiency. For instance, opportunities for low to medium heating through renewables, or replacing some energy inputs with biomass feedstock. These are the sorts of gains that free allocation with strong benchmarks can drive, but it's in the remaining opportunities that we face some challenges because of this carbon leakage challenge and constraints for these industries to pass on their carbon costs in their prices without losing competitiveness. So innovations in production processes are, of course, necessary, as I just mentioned, because of the nature of industrial processes. Material efficiency, so on the demand side, when lacking a carbon price pass-through, you're not really capturing increased recycling and recirculation, improved intermediate material use, and for instance, industries such as construction, and you're not really achieving lower carbon final consumption, encouraging improved product design, for instance. The evidence on carbon leakage, I'm imagining many of you already have firm opinions on and are well versed. There's little of it thus far, but there are reasons to continue taking these concerns seriously, particularly if you are a policymaker faced with these sorts of choices. The ex-ante studies widely or largely predict potential leakage effects within certain sectors, these sectors that we're talking about right now. Ex-post studies largely find little to no leakage effects, but there are reasons, or there are caveats, at least to consider. So for one, carbon prices have generally been low. All the systems that are being studied include carbon leakage protections, of course, the free allocation issue that we're going to be talking about more. And it might still be too early to observe long-run effects in investment, so major shifts in investment patterns. And of course, we're still likely to see continued divergence in carbon price levels and even higher carbon prices in the short to medium term will this issue at least of policymakers for years to come. Given that this concern is still likely to be on the agenda, but yet we have demand to achieve greater emissions reductions from these sectors, we organized our work in a sort of framework to consider both free allocation and alternatives to free allocation. So for one, there still needs to be continued protection against carbon leakage in both existing provisions and alternatives. So addressing this risk of leakage due to both loss of competitiveness and potential changes in investment patterns in the face of some of these abatement opportunities on the supply and the demand side of the equation, and developing new markets for low carbon technologies and products. And lastly, though, these policies need to be politically durable, both in terms of their administrative feasibility and their international acceptance. And in that sense, we'll be talking a lot about the World Trade Organization, especially with border carbon adjustments. So I'm going to give sort of just a flyby view of some of these chapters that followed. Again, we sort of looked at free allocation along these dimensions, evaluating along these three pillars, along with alternative policy options such as border carbon adjustments. We also looked at carbon leakage risk assessment and complementary policies such as innovation support that will be needed in this decarbonization challenge. In the case of free allocation, we looked at the three different modes of free allocation. So grandparenting based on just historical emissions, and then the two forms of benchmarking, fixed baseline period, where the sort of the activity levels are fixed, potentially with updating provisions, and output-based benchmarking, where the allocations are based more on recent or current activity levels. And we largely conclude that existing free allocation provisions are not compatible with this deep decarbonization challenge. So for instance, in the case of grandparenting and this fixed baseline period benchmarking, it's unlikely to provide significant leakage protections in the absence of updating the activity levels to reflect more recent levels of output. But of course, in the process of doing that, you can induce perverse incentives depending on the rules, depending on things like thresholds. And then on output-based benchmarking, there's of course strong leakage protections as it's based on recent output and sort of factors into marginal decision making. But through this, and you can, of course, also attain production efficiency with a good benchmark, also true of fixed baseline period benchmarking. But in the case of output-based allocation, the price pass-through is limited because you're tying allocation close to recent production levels. So it's acting as a production subsidy. So you're achieving carbon leakage protection, but at the expense of resource efficiency and particularly downstream abatement, because there's limited pass-through, and a somewhat limited case to finance climate-friendly technologies, in the sense that the opportunity is more at achieving production efficiency and potentially becoming a net seller of allowances. But this is a less credible sort of investment framework than if you had full cost pass-through. And then lastly, of course, there's this tension in the medium to long term between cap trajectories and free allocation budgets that we highlighted before. And the question will then become whether these industries can keep pace with these declines, which are coming thanks to things like cap adjustment factors in places like California. And this will come down to where opportunities lie for abatement. If production efficiency is largely exhausted, the question is whether these approaches can achieve innovation. And this is quite doubtful, much less credible at the very least. Turning to leakage risk assessment, just to sort of basically start off so we're all on the same page, generally speaking, two criteria, or not just generally speaking, pretty much universally in emissions trading systems, two criteria are usually applied to determine how sectors qualify for free allocation: emissions intensity and trade exposure. The emissions intensity measure is basically just supposed to tell you to what extent would a carbon price increase production costs, often as a measure of sort of emissions relative to gross value added, or some similar measure. Then with trade exposure, the question is how intense is international trade in this sector, which would imply a constraint in an organization's ability to pass on their carbon costs. The greater trade intensity, the more constraint there is to pass on carbon costs in product prices. So it's sort of largely acting as a proxy. And emissions trading systems usually apply these either as a sort of binary. There's a threshold. If you meet that threshold, you qualify for leakage protections, or there's sort of maybe a tiered-based approach whereby there's sort of like everything is separated into different levels of leakage risk based on different thresholds, and you can vary allocation based on these different thresholds. We looked at a range of different sort of alternatives to measure leakage risk, and we found that unfortunately these sort of present some of their own challenges. So there are a lot of criticisms of both emissions intensity and trade exposure. On emissions intensity, this measure itself doesn't consider the emissions intensity of trading partners, thus it doesn't fully capture the leakage risk. It doesn't capture carbon costs in other jurisdictions, which, as we mentioned, is important. It also doesn't capture an organization's abatement potential and costs. The challenge with metrics that capture these issues is on things like data availability, particularly in the case of emission intensity of trading partners, challenge of consistent and robust application on something like abatement potential, or just shortcomings in the utility of the indicators. For instance, emissions intensity of trading partners doesn't necessarily alleviate competitiveness concerns. Then on trade exposure, some common criticisms are that there is evidence of cost pass-through in leakage vulnerable sectors. There's not really any consideration of the market structure, the nature of competition that these sectors face. Something like market concentration can indicate an ability to act as more of a price maker rather than a price taker. And then other things like transportation costs, these are not factored in. Again, somewhat similar challenges of data availability and estimation. In the case of things like transportation costs and getting into different scopes of emissions. There's sometimes requirements for detailed understanding of value chains, and there's also issues of sectoral heterogeneity in the case of things like market structure and things like that. And of course, cost pass-through as well, as some of the literature on that shows. To conclude on leakage risk assessments, we have to at least acknowledge that the criteria of emissions intensity and trade exposure have somewhat balanced the trade-off of accuracy, consistency, and administrative feasibility. There are additional tests out there, the kinds of things that I was just talking about, but there's no clear options in the sense of improving broad and consistent leakage assessment because of challenges in implementing some of these things, and then increasing complexity and even potential for greater lobbying from firms to qualify for leakage protection. Some possible approaches could be lifting the sort of overall thresholds for qualification, so these emission intensity and trade exposure thresholds, and then applying more complex assessment for lower risk levels. So relieving some of the administrative burden and allowing you to take more of a qualitative approach to these lesser risk sectors. The EU, for instance, has a bit more of a qualitative approach for sectors that are on the border of qualifying. And then there's tiered allocation, setting these sectors according to different levels of risk with the thresholds, such that Quebec does and California was considering doing. New Zealand also does to some extent. But in general, we see a need for enhanced cooperation globally on leakage provisions to improve data sharing and to sort of better understand leakage protections and other measures, and to further develop methodologies for alternative ways of assessment. So a big bulk of our work was focused on alternatives to free allocation. That was centered on border carbon adjustments and consumption charges. And again, I'm going to give sort of the flyby view. The report gives a much more thorough view. Border carbon adjustments will probably take most of the oxygen today. And as many of you probably know at this point, they're basically tariffs or other measures applied on imports, sometimes on exports in the form of rebates or not having compliance obligations, with the goal of eliminating differences in carbon costs. And by doing this, by leveling the playing field, the goal is to allow for this cost pass-through that we actually want to better incentivize abatement. I'm not going to go into the World Trade Organization literature. We do talk a bit about that, but there are also better sources on this, among some Michael Mailing. But the key issue with border carbon adjustments, as anyone has taken a look at this issue will tell you, that they raise major WTO implications. Typically, when border carbon adjustments have been discussed, it's usually as a replacement for free allocation, because that's when they work most optimally anyway, because you're wanting this greater cost pass-through. But as many of you probably know, discussion in the EU currently, there's a lot of talk about maintaining free allocation, at least as a transition. This likely has WTO implications, but the arguments are largely coming down to issues of competitiveness and avoiding industry opposition. Consumption charges are a lesser known option, but there's somewhat an alternative to border carbon adjustments. So they would be paired with free allocation. The key difference with border carbon adjustments is where they're applied. In this case, it's basically a charge based on benchmark, an allowance price, and weight of material applied at the point of consumption. So the producers release it, they sell it down the value chain, and the consumption charge applies at that point. You maintain benchmark-based free allocation for the producers to maintain leakage protections. It's not the consumption charge that's maintaining the free allocation in this case, or is maintaining the leakage protection. It's the free allocation. The idea is that this charge at the point of consumption can incentivize downstream abatement. So these things like efficient use of goods, better recycling, material substitution. And then at the border, there's equivalent charge on the same imported goods. Any good that's covered domestically, there's the same charge applied on like imported goods. I'll give one slide on sort of the basics of border carbon adjustment, because key to understanding border carbon adjustments is that there is this trade-off in the key design choices and the effectiveness and feasibility of the instrument. So the first key question is the trade flow coverage. Do you cover just imports, exports, or both? Full coverage, so including rebates for exports to markets that don't have carbon prices. You significantly enhance the leakage protections potentially for sectors that have high imports, but adding this export adjustment significantly increases the risk of WTO noncompliance. Both the subsidies and countervailing measures agreement, and if you're trying to argue for an environmental exception to the general agreement on tariffs and trade through Article 20. Then you have the question of the emission scope. Does it apply to just direct emissions from these industrial processes, or their indirect emissions from electricity and other energy inputs? And indirect emissions, of course, are very substantial for certain sectors, particularly some non-ferrous metals like aluminum, but including them does add to the complexity of the instrument and WTO challenges. There might be challenges in setting effective benchmarks and constraints around what you can do on those benchmarks, for instance, because of WTO challenges. And then lastly, there's the question of how do you decide what's the carbon content of one of these goods? How do you price it based on the carbon content of these goods? So the determination of the embedded carbon. The best option would be using facility level verified emissions. So at the facility level. This is somewhat infeasible in terms of demanding this from every overseas exporter. The fallback option is a benchmark-based approach, and the most likely option being on the implementing jurisdiction's emissions. So basing it on those emissions of the jurisdiction that's putting the BCA in place. It's the most administratively feasible option in terms of data availability. It's most likely the most likely WTO compliant, but it's less effective where foreign competitors are significantly less efficient. And benchmarks based on each foreign exporter are quite challenging, both from an administrative feasibility standpoint and with WTO concerns. For some conclusions on these two instruments, as I kind of just highlighted, the key thing about border carbon adjustments are that these WTO risks and challenges with administrative feasibility do pose major constraints on what a BCA can achieve on leakage and competitiveness. This effectiveness is likely going to vary by sector and design and what these constraints imply, particularly on the issue of export rebates. Phasing out free allocation, which is sort of the elephant in the room in the EU, it's critical to unlocking the abatement potential of a BCA. But as we're seeing from the EU discussion, a transition period might be advisable and even necessary from an industry standpoint, especially in the absence of the possibility of rebating for exports. So it's more getting at this competitiveness argument. Consumption charges could be a more legally and administratively feasible option. They resemble value-added taxes, sort of widely in place worldwide. Though the extension to these consumption charges to further products downstream, which might be necessary, does add to their complexity. And we talk about that in the paper in a bit greater depth. A key downside of consumption charges is, of course, this continued reliance on free allocation. It's not the charge itself that's providing the leakage protection, but the maintenance of free allocation. And as we've just noted throughout the paper and today, this is one of the key questions. And then it does need to be pointed out with the consumption charges that they don't level differences in carbon pricing at the border. It's not a border carbon adjustment. And thereby, there's not really incentives for abatement among trading partners, and not really an incentive for other jurisdictions to ratchet down free allocation. To conclude, we also certainly recognize the importance of complementary policies to play a role in addition to carbon pricing. So complementary policies in addition to carbon pricing in the decarbonization challenge. And we give sort of a cursory view of some of these, all of which deserve greater attention and greater research, particularly carbon contracts for difference, which I think we'll probably end up talking about in a second. All of these have different effects on the sort of the supply and the demand side. In the case of encouraging low carbon production, you have carbon contracts for difference, which are getting a lot of attention, particularly in the EU level right now. They're somewhat akin to a sort of feed-in premium, but for industry, aimed at de-risking investments in low carbon production and sort of reducing abatement costs by guaranteeing a certain payment for emissions reductions below a best available technology. Then there, of course, there is room for continued support for low carbon innovation through subsidies, grants, particularly for upstream markets, so more in the development of industrial technologies. So in the case of the EU, this would be things like the Innovation Fund. Then there is opportunities to drive greater demand abatement. It's debatable where you classify product carbon requirements, but we talk about this a bit in the paper. Basically, we're talking about standards for that would determine how emissions intensive a product can be in a given market, largely starting as voluntary standards, voluntary labeling, just because there's not necessarily enough productive capacity to produce low carbon goods. There aren't sufficiently developed markets for many low carbon goods such that you could have mandatory product carbon standards. And then lastly, there is a role for governments to play in fueling low carbon consumption through green public procurement, which we don't actually talk about in the paper, but we note it here anyway. So.
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you for your presentation. Actually, thank you for the study, which is very rich. You gave us a flyby view, but already from this flyby view, we can see how rich the study is. I have a few questions, and I see some questions also coming from the audience. My first question is the following. You correctly mentioned that carbon leakage was not evident so far, but carbon prices were low, among other things. So if we look into the future and we look to climate neutrality to be reached by 2050, we may expect carbon leakage to emerge. So you also mentioned a number of instruments. On top of those, free allocation, carbon border adjustment, I would like to mention also the possibility of linking different emission trading system, which is the object of our project Life Digit here at FSR Climate. So my question is, do you think there is a first best instrument to fight carbon leakage, or do you see a mixture of them all, or a transition, as you already mentioned, and at what speed in this case?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I should first say that as an intergovernmental body, we're always sort of sensitive to advocating particular policies. I think ultimately it is a mixture. I think optimally there's greater linking in the sense that this does address the leakage concern in the sense that you have price convergence in linked markets. You're dealing with export competitiveness issues, at least within the linked area. Critically, you're not necessarily amongst trading partners outside of the linked market. But of course, this is it's challenging to integrate carbon markets, and it's not necessarily a satisfying answer to industries or to policymakers who have to regulate those industries and hear from those industries. So ultimately, I think that leads us at a mixture, perhaps the continued pursuit of linking and more integrated carbon markets as sort of the long-term goal, but in the background, needing a mixture of policies and maybe increasingly having different instruments for different sectors based on different vulnerabilities. The border carbon adjustment idea, for instance, it might have a certain appeal for certain sectors. For instance, maybe those that are a bit less trade intensive, but have high degree of emissions intensity. So you can sort of get past some of these export competitiveness issues. Then perhaps there is still a degree of free allocation for other sectors, but maybe you're making reforms to free allocation to make it a bit more nuanced in the direction of sort of like a more of a tiered-based approach, or simply a more detailed approach to assessing risk, assessing eligibility for free allocation. And I think an important part in this mixture are these complementary policies, of course, as well, especially on technology.
Sure. There is one question coming from the audience, which is from Cyril, who's asking, what are your views or recommendations with regard to the European Commission proposal of carbon border adjustment mechanism? Should the CBA be limited to taxation of manufactured goods imported into the EU, for instance? And on this, I would also like to invite Stefano Verde, my colleague from FSR Climate, who had a question on a similar topic outside Europe, maybe. So, Stefano, you want to add?
Yes, let me first say thank you to Christopher. It's nice to see him again. And congratulations for the report. You had to cover, and the presentation, you had to cover a lot of ground in it. Yes, I have a question that is almost a curiosity, given your, I mean, the fact that you work at ICAP. I was wondering whether this debate about all this discussion about the carbon border tax, carbon border adjustments is limited to confined to the EU, or also other jurisdictions have been considering it. Yeah, so for the moment, this is my question.
Okay, both very good questions. I'll take Cyril's question first, and I'll be diplomatic. So I mean, I can't offer recommendations to the EC proposal. They are of course a member of ICAP, along with many of the national governments, the member states. What I could note, though, and I'm not the first to say this, I guess I would go back to what I was saying before about the major constraints that they face, and the unenviable position of having to design the world's first border carbon adjustment with the aim of actually making it WTO compliant. It seems quite clear from legal scholarship that export rebates would be very challenging. So it seems, and I guess I'm not overspeaking when I say the Commission itself seems to be leaning toward an imports-based only proposal. Their inception impact assessment doesn't make any reference to export rebates, and their own public statements don't seem to go in this direction. But I certainly can't recommend anything. But yeah, that's partly also why this issue of free allocation becomes so important, because having viewed many public consultations on this, led by people like André Marcoux with ERCST in Brussels, they're doing amazing work on this subject. But it's very clear across the board, from industries from cement to aluminum to steel, that a border carbon adjustment that doesn't have export rebates and discontinuation of free allocation is something they're unlikely to support. So that's sort of the key challenge, I think, that the EU will need to navigate. And it's not sort of a slam dunk that free allocation will be WTO compliant. It's not a slam dunk that anything in this will be WTO compliant because it hasn't been attempted. But those would be some key questions going forward for them. Those are issues that I'm particularly watching. I hope I answered that decently well. And so, yeah, in terms of the sectoral scope, I mean, there's a possibility of energy intensive, there's a possibility of energy commodities in the sense of refineries being covered. There's a possibility of that. I don't think they've ruled that out, but very, very likely that it will be a narrow sectoral scope at first. Electricity would also very much be on the board, partly because of growing imports from North Africa, Ukraine, places like that. So to move to Stefano's question, so my sense from the ICAP jurisdictions, no one's really taken sort of a position on this. I think everyone is very engaged in this issue and very much actively following it, particularly places that have high trade exposure to the EU, like Quebec, for instance, and who also submitted their own document during the public consultation. So there's very high interest among the jurisdictions. I think it's too early for them. First of all, they would never take a position publicly, or even sort of privately. It's just, I don't think it's something that they would, it's not really something that they would do in sort of our space. But they are very interested and they're actively following it. I think they, like many others, want to see how this plays out, what the first proposal looks like, and then how it fares in the WTO, how discussions that precede the proposal being enacted go, because there probably will need to be some fairly extensive bi- and multilateral discussions with trade partners. It's still just rather early for anyone to go beyond sort of we're engaged and we're watching. And I would also note, in the case of ICAP, we have a lot of subnational jurisdictions, so places like California, Quebec, and they face unique constraints in their ability to have border-related measures. California, for instance, because of things like the US Constitution and limits to what you can do to impede trade between states. So they could potentially face both WTO and lawsuits from neighboring states. So lawsuits from Utah and and China. So they face unique constraints. Yeah.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, we have just 1 minute to go. I would like to ask many more questions. As you see, we are only asking thought-provoking and provocative questions, but let's say that's the style of our FSR talk. Let me pass on to Jean-Michel if he has one of his thought-provoking questions, or just to conclude. Jean-Michel.
I will nevertheless ask a question because Christopher is an expert. Christopher, we have a lot of very interesting pledges. Well, we have the EU, of course, but we have Japan, South Korea. We have also the new presidency in the US. We have China. In this context, do you see a role for climate coalitions like climate clubs, climate teams?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting idea and worthy of attention. I think I personally am always sort of, when the climate club argument comes up, it always strikes me as something that makes a lot of sense, but it's sort of like devil in the details idea. I would love to see what these discussions would look like in terms of really coming to agreement on tough issues like minimum prices or sort of price corridors, and treatment of industrial allocation and things like this. But sort of on its face, it has a lot of merit. And within these clubs, certainly within the clubs, you could begin to address leakage concerns. But of course, you might also have greater leverage and legitimacy to create measures at the border, because you're not addressing the issues. Of course, trade flows come from all over the world, and so you also would likely need some sort of agreement on measures at the border within the club. Everyone has some sort of common agreement on that. So at the same time, I don't think this border carbon adjustment measure necessarily, I don't think the discussion goes away if you start to have climate clubs, at least in the sort of short to medium term. Maybe as you got more members of this climate club on board, of course, then it becomes less necessary, because everyone's playing by the same or similar rules. Yeah, I think it'd be super interesting, and maybe early discussions on this will take into consideration different levels of economic development, and there will be agreement to allow sort of even different speeds within a climate club. I think it's a super interesting idea and worth more attention.
Then, ladies, gentlemen, we are creating a new club, Christopher, Simone, and me, and we will give you our definitive conclusions in December 2040, 2060. Good ride all the way.
Stay tuned until then.
Thank you, everyone. I'm sorry I went over on my presentation, clearly, but
Do not worry, Christopher. Till 2040, we have time to recover.
Thank you, Christopher.
Ciao a tutti.